Well, hello, all you lovely people. Professor Gray here with a module now, a very fresh module on ethical subjectivism. Fresh. On ethical subjectivism. Now, so far we've been on this little meta-ethical journey through moral relativism, and just recall what meta-ethics is. Recall it's meta-ethics focuses on analyzing what claims in ethics mean and how these claims are justified. So what we've been looking at then has been moral relativism. Now recall, again, always going through the definitions first, right? So recall now what moral relativism is. Recall moral relativism is the meta-ethical claim that there are no objective and universal moral values, norms, and principles applying to all people everywhere. Morality depends on or is relative to either cultural or individual acceptance. Now notice that last part there is what's breaking it off into two versions of moral relativism. It's relative or based on individual acceptance, which we'll talk about today, or it's based on cultural acceptance, which we talked about in our last class, our last module. So let's just remind ourselves about the cultural version of moral relativism. And that version is known as, well, not too clever of a name, but cultural relativism. Now recall, just again reviewing these concepts so they're fresh in our mind and we're getting comfortable using them. Recall that cultural relativism is also a meta-ethical claim that morality is a matter of social and cultural acceptance because morality is solely determined by the customs and laws of one's own society and culture. Now, remember, we saw this is meta-ethical, so it's telling us the nature of ethics, what ethical claims mean, and how do we justify claims in ethics. So for the cultural relativist, we go back to the practical question, our old friend, the practical question, what ought I do? And the cultural relativist says, well, this is an easy answer. The nature of ethics is about cultural and social acceptance and nothing more. So to answer the practical question for yourself, you just say, well, do whatever it is that my society or culture says I ought to do. That's what you should be doing. Pretty simple, straightforward, seductive in its power of answering that practical question. But of course, then justification is where we saw the problems because you say, well, why should I do these things? And it's because your culture says so. And that's how we do things here. And that's it. That is how we do things here. That's how you justify it. So again, all you have to know what to do, look to your cultural norms, laws, and so on. That will tell you what's right and what's wrong. So we saw a defense of that theory, and we saw why Rachels were not impressed by it. Again, that justificatory step where you kind of stop the conversation by saying that's how we do things here created all sorts of problems. And you can review the video to see, what those problems were. Okay, so that's the previous module. Now we're continuing in moral relativism, but now we're going to focus on that part of individual acceptance, which is known as ethical subjectivism. And I defined it last time, but now we're going to talk about it a lot, so I'll be repeating this definition a lot for this module. So what is ethical subjectivism? Well, ethical subjectivism is the meta-ethical claim that morality is a matter of individual acceptance because morality is solely determined by one's own personal reactions and feelings. Morality is a matter of individual, personal acceptance. And again, we're going to see very analogous to with the cultural version, this individual version now, when we think again, what the practical question, what ought I do? And this has a pretty good answer. Well, good answer, I don't know, we'll decide that later, but it has a very simple answer, that's for sure. It says, do what feels right. And that's ethics. What feels right to you. What ought I do? What feels like the right thing. If it feels wrong, don't do it. Let your heart be your guide. Follow your gut. And speaking of the gut, so what I have next to show you is this video. It's from the very first episode of the Colbert Report. Now Stephen Colbert has his own show on The Late Show. But this goes back to his old show, early days, so the video quality, not so good, I understand. But this is from literally the first episode of his show. God, I don't remember the year. But George W. Bush was president, as you'll see by the jokes in the video. So he is joking around, but what we're seeing here is he introduces this concept, it's his word of the day, truthiness. And as you'll see, when he's talking about what truthiness means, he is talking in terms of ethical subjectivism for sure. This is a very subjectivist view, truthiness. And he does mention some current affairs. This was happening during when George W. Bush had nominated Harriet Miers for the Supreme Court. She's not a justice, so I guess you know how that story turned out. She did not make it through confirmation. But this is the jokes themselves don't matter, so don't worry about that if you don't know those old historical. God, I'm old. That now things that I remember are history now. I guess we live in a very different world now. Anyway, you can watch that video. Don't worry if you don't get all the jokes. I think the sense of what he means by truthiness and why that's subjectivist should become pretty clear pretty fast. And I think it's kind of funny. We'll see if it's old, so maybe it's not so funny anymore. I don't know. So after that, after you come back to me, and I'll have a couple more videos for you. I'll talk first about David Hume and he's a very famous philosopher. This is probably our first really big-time philosopher we're actually reading. We've talked about other big-time philosophers, but now you're actually reading an article, sections from David Hume. Great, maybe some people consider him the greatest philosopher ever. We'll see if you agree on that or not. We'll look very closely at the text. So when you watch that video, make sure you pull out or have a copy ready, because I will kind of focus on some specific passages since it is a trickier text. So we'll talk about that and how he defends why he thinks ethical subjectivism is the right way to approach ethics and morality. Then I'll have a final video where we go back to Rachel's and Rachel's again, because you know how they like to criticize everything. So they also give a pretty standard philosophical argument about why a lot of philosophers don't really find ethical subjectivism all that attractive. And that'll wrap up then our discussion of relativism. Then the next module will go into, well, what's left? Then what do we do? If we're not relativist, what are we doing? And we'll get to that. That's way later, next module. So for now, go watch that video on truthiness by Stephen Colbert. It's not too long. And then I'll see you back here and we can talk about ethical subjectivism.